Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, Wendigo in Wisconsin. This is still hard for me to wrap my head around because it shook me to my core, but this story takes place just over a year ago in late November 2018. I live in a rural suburb in SEWI near a line of woods and ponds. My town is small, and everything is silent and dark by 9 p.m. I tend to walk my dog after dinner and before bed, and my town is pretty safe, so walking her in the dark never fazed me. Until this. I live in an apartment complex that is on the end of a residential street, so most of the street is older houses. One night I was walking my dog, around 10:30 p.m. I think, when I saw something on the front lawn of one of these houses. They didn't have a light on their front porch, so most of their lawn was dark, but with lights from the surrounding houses I could see a figure standing in the middle of their lawn. It was very tall and skinny, almost as tall as the roof of their ranch house, because even standing in the middle of the front yard it looked almost as tall as the house. It was standing on its hind legs but had antlers, or some type of tall ears like a bunny, and its arms and legs were abnormally long and stretched to the bone. The moment I saw it, my body froze, and I had that feeling that you only get when you're near immediate danger or evil. For context, I love the supernatural, paranormal, and true crime. I've lived in a without-a-doubt haunted house, frequently go on after-hours explorations of known haunted places, and have seen and experienced many paranormal events. That feeling is undeniable once you are familiar with it. So this tall, lanky creature is standing there, and I can't see its face, but by its positioning I know it has noticed me also. My dog, who is normally aware of every living creature from a mile away in a snowstorm, is completely unaware of its presence. It felt like longer, but it was only a few seconds before this creature jumped straight up in the air, and I mean straight up, not forward, and bounded to the back of the house in 3 large strides. It didn't make a sound, and the way it jumped and moved was unlike any animal I've ever seen. The closest I would akin it to would be a deer, but it was on its hind legs and had the body features of a stretched-out human, but with antlers or tall ears. I felt stuck and almost hypnotized by the whole thing, but came to my senses enough to call attention to my dog and turn around to head for home. Behind all of the houses on this side of the street is woods, and some of the trees wrap around between this house and the neighboring house coming back towards home. We turned around, my eyes glued to the trees, and when we got to the middle of the houses I could see 2 eyes watching me through the 2 houses. The presence and overall weight of the feeling this whole encounter gave me still sticks with me as clearly as the night it happened. I can remember it all so vividly and still feel the weight. Ever since that night I've been thinking about it and running through all of the possibilities of what it could be, but always coming up with no explanation. It wasn't until about a month ago that I was watching a special on supernatural encounters that I heard about Wendigos. The description fit perfectly and made my blood run even colder. I'm fully convinced that what I saw that night had to have been a Wendigo. I've made a point to only walk my dog during the daylight during the summer months, and on the connecting street that is the main road of my town that is at least lit with streetlights in the winter when it gets dark before I'm even home from work. Since that night, I haven't had any other direct encounter with it, except one event that I'm not sure is related but elicited that same feeling of being watched and almost felt. Across from my apartment complex, on the same side as the woods and the encounter, there is a small pond surrounded by trees. A few weeks ago my brother was over, and he was outside smoking when he came in quickly and locked the door behind him. I had mentioned my encounter to him when it first happened, but he shrugged it off like most people I told, and likely didn't give it a second thought. He looked shaken and kept looking through the peephole in my door and not saying anything. He finally got out that he was outside smoking and heard loud dragging and rustling sounds coming from the wooded pond area. He said he was listening for about a minute and thought he caught a glimpse of something very tall near the tree line. He described it as the sound it would make if someone were dragging a heavy animal or body through rough brush/woods, and he had a feeling of dread and heaviness, like he couldn't look away and was being honed in on by something. Normally, I'm the type of person that would go out and look for myself, maybe even going down by the pond to explore and find something, but this case shuts all of that down. There is something viscerally evil about this creature that not even I care to explore further. I've tried telling people in my life about all of this, but, as most people do with this type of stuff, none of them really put any stock into it except my brother now that he's had this experience. I'm of the mind that things beyond our comprehension and everyday scope absolutely do exist, and this is one I won't be messing with or going on adventures to see again. Legends and beliefs exist for a reason, and this is one I don't want to mess with. So, Wendigo in my neighborhood, let's not meet. Second story. My hometown is growing. Please help us before we blossom. They didn't deserve that. They don't deserve that. I don't deserve this. No one does. The thing is, I was never close with my parents. I mean, I loved them and had no problems hanging out around each other. We just were never close, you know? There was always a distance that we never bothered to close. So, when I moved away to uni, I didn't look back. There wasn't even much to look back to. My hometown wasn't even that. It was just a collection of small houses that had happened to be built at the intersection of two roads. I mean, sure, our town appeared on the map, but that's just because they had to put a name there. It was a nowhere place with nothing of worth, except my family. University was hard. I mean, obviously it was hard academics-wise, but the change from living amongst the same 7 families my entire life to a city with hundreds of thousands gave me whiplash. But still, I thrived. I clawed my way up with everything I had to escape from where I had come from. Even though some of my peers doubted me and others whispered trailer trash behind my back, I proved them wrong. I was better than them, not through some trust fund, but through my own hard work. I tried at every opportunity to forget my past, including leaving my parents behind. When summer break came around and I had no other plans, I decided that I would visit home. I don't know why I decided to go back. It's not like I had any reason to suspect anything was different. I hadn't even messaged my folks in the 8 months since my mom's birthday. I just found myself making the long drive back home in the midst of a summer heat wave with nothing but empty fields in every direction. Anyway, I eventually arrived just outside the boundaries separating my town from the endless farmland and had to slow my car to a halt. There was a concrete barrier blocking the entire road from being used. The only thing indicating that the road stopped so abruptly was a sign posted on the top of the barrier, "Dead End." I had to drive into the ditch to get around the blockade, somehow getting my car stuck in the process. I swore to the sky and was reminded how much I hated this place. I should have taken that as a sign to leave, to think that maybe the barrier was there for a reason and that someone knew. Someone had to know. Still, I pressed forward, determined to not let this awful place get the better of me. The town was quiet. Not a single sound other than the wind chimes and some faint noise carried by the wind. It had always been quiet, but somehow, I knew it was different. There were definitely more trees in the front yards of my neighbors than I remembered. I also noticed that there was what seemed to be an empty ambulance parked in front of a house at the other end of the street, silently sitting with its doors open and its sirens off. When I let myself into my old house, the only sound that I could now hear was the static from the old radio, my dad used to listen to the news with. The faint aroma of lavender also filled my nostrils. It wasn't dark in the house, quite the opposite. It was bright. Every curtain was opened, and every light was turned on, showing how dusty the house had become. It also meant I could see everything. My father sat in his old reclining chair facing out to the backyard with his back to me. It was almost right out of a greeting card. If not for the shallow wheezing, I could hear from him. When I rushed over to make sure he was okay, I saw the front half of his body. It looked like his skin had melted in the chair, rooting him in place, unable to move. Thin tendrils made of flesh and muscle stretched out of his feet in front of him, covering the carpet in a slick, bloody flower bed. Every inch of the front half of my dad's body bloomed outward, stretching into the sunlight to try and get as much nutrients as possible. His skin burst open from what looked like boils, unfolding into petals and pistils. Some sprouted out of his orifices, growing and growing and growing, grasping for the sun outside the window. I puked and I screamed. I thought my dad had died and I had not even known. I wish. When I looked at where his eyes had been, between the skin leaves and throbbing bulbs, I saw him looking at me, and I saw fear. Those eyes that I had tried to even forget the color of begged me for help. No matter what had to be done to stop the pain. I ripped at the flowers and roots, trying to get him free, but his flowering skin shuddered, and he squelched out a small, muffled moan through a throat full of flowers. It had hurt him. It hurt him to simply be alive. I fumbled to find my phone in my pocket to dial 911, but it didn't seem to go through. All I heard was the dial tone and the faint sound of wind chimes on the other end of the line. I looked around the rest of the house to try and find something to help him. I tried the bleach under the kitchen counter, but that only seemed to pleasure the flowers. Searching in the dining room, I saw a lighter next to my mother's birthday cake, now rotting with small blossoming flies sticking out of the fuzzy frosting. It wasn't long until I found what I assumed was my mother. She was outside in the back garden, grimly enough. She had grown into a sprawling tree, her bones splintering into branches that stretched into the sky. Her bark scabbed over, dripping with sap and pus. She resembled a cherry tree, with raw pink wounds budding into flowers. She was also alive, for however much I wish it weren't true. She managed to even stutter out telling me to kill her. No one could help. Every one of my neighbors' houses held the same thing. Now seeing the trees outside for what they really were, I rushed past every house I could, hoping and searching for anyone to help me or my parents. There were dozens of flower beds littering the lawns, with flowering arms reaching out in the sky, asking for help and sunlight. One of the most disturbing sights was the playset that the Evans had owned, now wrapped in vines. One of my neighbors, who I think was named Ted, had it worst. It had taken me a while to find him as he was in his basement at the time. It was dark and fine particles obscured the effects of my phone's flashlight. Still, through my coughing and blinking to get the dust out of my face, I eventually found what was Ted. What Ted is. He had collapsed into a heap of flesh, nothing being able to take root in the concrete floor of the unfinished basement. The flowers that covered him had wilted and shriveled, gangrene and necrotic tissue covering his entire body. He didn't even have a face anymore. His eyes unraveled into white lilacs, and his tongue uncoiled into something similar to a grapevine. Every part of it blossomed to try and uselessly grasp at the sunlight that was not there. I think it hurt him to be away from the light more than it hurt the others inside it. I didn't care. I had come down to Ted's basement for another reason, and I had found it. I snatched the gasoline and ran back to my parents' house. It took me a while to thoroughly cover the house with enough for me to be certain, using up the entire can and praying that someone else would come along to help my neighbors. Then, I used my candle lighter to set my childhood home on fire, waiting and making sure that my parents were thoroughly burned. The wind chimes still rang as I heard the willow tree that we had never planted behind the house weep. It was as I started to walk away, certain that the house was thoroughly burning, that I tripped over my own foot. When I looked down, I saw that my shoe had split open, with thin tendrils digging into the grass beneath me. I scrambled to try and get up, ripping the thin strands of nerves out of the ground in excruciating pain. But before I could do anything, I realized my back was now leaching into the ground as well. Every movement I made to try and get up only pulled on my nervous system, shooting pain worse than anything I've ever felt through my body. Even as I coughed up blood and felt my throat expanding, I couldn't do anything but sit there and cry. Pustules have started to appear all over my body, eagerly waiting to pop and embrace the sun. It hurts to breathe. The insides of my lungs have bloomed already and scratch at every breath. My throat is full of roots and petals, so I can't even call for help anymore. I've managed to type this though. The roots in my hand may have burrowed into my phone, but it has worked long enough for me to do this. I'm glad I could help my parents. I will soon bloom and smell of lavender. I hope someone comes soon. Someone must know. Whether it's the CDC or the government. Someone has to prune me, or I will grow into a meadow. Third story. There's an ancient tribe residing in our local woods. When my dog ran off into the woods during one of our walks, I knew I couldn't chase after her right away. Everyone in our town knew that the woods weren't empty. There was something in there, and especially the older residents insisted that it was people. Or at least something akin to people. They called them the tribe. I never fully embraced these beliefs, but I still acted according to them. There were just too many things off about the woods for the tribe to be nothing but an old legend. The fact that everyone was utterly convinced the tribe was real in itself was cause for concern. I'd never heard of anybody venturing into the forest, not even to prove the saying wrong. There was nobody working there either, despite the area being so huge. If the woods were normal, chances are there'd be foresters and woodcutters, or maybe even hunters in there. That's what I figured. Our pets usually stayed far away from the treeline as well. At that point, I had no idea why Chips, my dog, had gone off there in the first place. She had never shown any interest in the woods, and had even seemed apprehensive about getting too close to them. That's why I always thought it safe to walk alongside the treeline. I was sure she'd never leave my side. Her tearing the leash from my hands and dashing off into the thicket that day had happened completely unexpectedly. At least I knew who to go to for advice. There's this guy named Duncan. He's very old, maybe even the oldest man in the entire town, and definitely the most knowledgeable. He hangs out at a small pub most of the time, so I was sure I'd find him there. I got on my way as fast as I could. When I arrived at the bar, I needed to stop for a moment to catch my breath before looking around inside. The interior was dark in its colors, the wood of the floor and the counter as well as the tables being of a warm, deep brown. The lights were just bright enough for me to easily spot the man I'd been looking for over in one of the corner tables. There weren't a lot of other people inside the pub at the time. Duncan lifted his head in mild surprise when he noticed me approaching. We weren't total strangers. In a town as small as ours, basically everyone knew each other. "Hello," I gasped. He lifted his glass to me with a lazy smile of greeting, but didn't say anything. "I need to go into the woods. My dog ran off." He gave me a nod as if to tell me to say no more. He went straight to business. "First off, go in there by yourself. They don't take kindly to groups and noise. And be respectful to those you meet inside." He lowered his head slightly. "You know, they don't refrain from leaving those woods because they don't want to. Does that mean they're trapped there or something?" "Not trapped. The woods are their home. and this is ours. And we've forbidden them from entering ours. That's why they don't come out." Duncan looked me over. His brows creased almost like he was trying to figure out if I'd understood the gravity of the situation. Seemingly satisfied, he nodded and went on. "The woods are big, easy to get lost in. There's a single path through. It leads into the woods, and it'll lead you back out. You're safe there. Follow it, and you won't get lost." Duncan gave me a few seconds to let everything sink in before continuing once more. "You don't want to give anyone in there your real name. Names are taboo. Knowing your name will give them power over you, to be used in our world." His wording was ominously cryptic. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "It means you won't be able to get rid of them." He sighed. "Never mind, just don't let it come to that. Make up a nickname or something and expect them to do the same. They're very careful with that kind of thing. That's easy enough to remember, I'd say. You'll eventually come across the people in there, and you're going to have to talk to them. There's no way around it. I don't want to scare you, but the further you proceed into those woods, the crazier the ones you're going to meet will be." Noticing my unease, Duncan gave me a quick smile. "It'll be okay. Just hurry, get in and out quickly, and avoid the deeper parts if you can. If you stay for too long, the people there and the woods themselves are going to start messing with your head. It's tricky, everything's different in there. Space, time even. Just keep that in mind. The whole place is going to want to screw you over." He let out a husky laugh, though I wasn't sure what he thought was funny. I stood up, thanking him profusely. I couldn't waste any more time. I hoped Chips hadn't gone deeper into the woods in the meantime. I was prepared well enough as I was. I still had all of my dog-walking supplies in my pockets, treats for Chips, pepper spray, and handkerchiefs. In case it'd be dark, I'd have to make do with the flashlight on my phone, but that was all right. I headed straight for the woods. I knew where to find the path. I'd walked by it before. Actually stepping onto it, however, felt quite different. There was a strong sense of unease within me all of a sudden. I was barely 2 steps past the treeline, and already I felt like I was in a whole other world. Maybe it was all the expectation, the anxiety built by Duncan's instructions, but when I turned to glance behind me, back outside, it looked so far away. The trail was just wide enough for me to stand on. The feeling of dread grew stronger the further I went. The trees around me stood tall and imposing, and in some places their leaves were so lush I couldn't see the sky above. I tried to calm my mind by listening to my surroundings. They say the sounds of nature are the most soothing there are, but somehow, the singing of the birds and the quiet chirping of insects around me only added to my discomfort. Suddenly, there was something else. The sound of water trickling down and hitting the soft forest floor. Slightly startled, I glanced around frantically only to find the source just a few meters ahead of me. It was a man. His back was turned to me, and he was facing the tree in front of him. He probably hadn't noticed me yet, so I turned to look away and nervously cleared my throat. "Yeah, I know you're there. Give me a second, will you? Kind of busy here." "Oh, I'm sorry," I stammered, feeling my cheeks heat up. "It's fine." The sound of the liquid running ceased, and after 2 more seconds, I dared to turn around to him. I don't know what I'd been expecting, but he wasn't it. I looked him over as discreetly as I could. He was short, about my height, and of about the same age as me too. His clothes were fairly normal as well. Jeans, boots, and a white flannel shirt, the latter of which just a bit too baggy to flatter his slight frame. His dark, overgrown hair and the stubble on his face made him look a bit unkempt. "Nice to meet you," I said slowly. "If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you something. I hope it's not. Don't talk fancy with me. It makes me want to puke." Got it, I muttered, a bit embarrassed. That had been clear enough, though. Say, do you live here? You don't look like. I do, though. So? I'm looking for my dog. She's white with black speckles, pretty big. I held my hand up to my hip to indicate her height. I haven't seen her, he replied. And pets don't run in here for no reason. What do you mean? Maybe someone lured it away without you noticing. We can do stuff like that, you know? I'd watch my back if I were you. I swallowed, holding his gaze. I appreciate the advice, I finally said. I'll be on my way. The man in the white shirt gave me an indifferent shrug. Take care, I guess. I turned to leave with a queasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Glancing back over my shoulder, I found that the man was gone. Unnerved, I stuck to the path, focusing on looking around without leaving it. I called out for Chips every other minute, hesitant to alert anyone yet hopeful to spot my dog come running towards me from somewhere in the underbrush. No such luck. I did gain someone else's attention, though. She appeared right ahead of me, just a few feet off to the side from the path. An elderly woman with long gray hair and a wrinkled face. She was wearing a long, dirty dress that had probably been white at one point. She stood unmoving, even as I kept approaching. I cleared my throat. "Hello," I called out, stopping in my tracks. I didn't want to get too close to her. She didn't answer. "Excuse me, have you seen a dog come through?" I shouted. The woman slowly started walking towards me. Her steps were lumbering and heavy. Her head lowered. Her hair fell down to cover her face like a stringy, torn-up veil. Despite her sluggish movements, I was beginning to grow nervous. Something about the way she was stalking towards me made me feel like I was prey about to be lunged at. Not wanting to show my fear, I cautiously backed away. "Don't come any closer," I told her in the most commanding voice I could muster. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for the small can of pepper spray. I had no idea if I'd be able to defend myself with it at all, but I figured it'd be better than nothing. "Please," I said, "I'm not here to hurt you." The old woman extended her hand to touch my face. Her nails were long, sharp, and cracked. They looked almost like claws. I didn't dare to move when she ran them through my hair. Her dull eyes staring into mine. I held my breath. What was I supposed to do? Shove her away? I didn't want to risk provoking her. Then, suddenly, she grasped for my throat. I was just fast enough to duck and avoid her twisted, bony fingers. I dashed forward and took off running, my feet drumming on the soft dirt ground. I blindly raced ahead. I felt the can of pepper spray fall out of my open pocket, but I didn't stop to pick it up. Risking a glance over my shoulder, I saw her lumbering after me. She was not very fast, though, and I noticed she never once set foot on the path. It was like she needed to stay off it for some reason. Still, that didn't mean she couldn't hurt me. There was a low thud behind me. I staggered to a halt and turned to find that the old woman was lying on the ground. Next to her, a small rock. It must have hit her on the head. It had obviously caused her to tumble. Despite that, she was already pulling herself back up, and I took off down the trail again. At least this would help me lose her. I kept running until my sides were burning with pain and the sweat from my forehead was dripping down my neck. It was only when I was absolutely sure she wasn't behind me anymore that I finally slowed down. I dropped to my knees. My throat was sore and dry. Taking deep breaths, I sucked in the cool, fresh air. I was quietly muttering phrases of reassurance to myself, mixed with the occasional swear word. Suddenly, I heard someone clear their throat. I spun around only to find the man in the white shirt from before standing behind me. He looked rather pleased with himself. "Did you throw that rock?" "I did." Thank you so much, He silenced me with a dismissive wave of his hand, but he was smiling still. I bet she's more like what you were expecting to see here. He laughed and shook his head. Look, I don't really get why you're chasing after that mutt, but for what it's worth, I'm sure it's going to be interesting to watch. If you'll allow it, I'd like to come along. That'd be mutually beneficial, right? I'm not saying I'll carry you around or anything, but I'd make myself useful, help you out a bit. He drew out his words, leaving them to linger in the air. I didn't need to think about the offer very long. Yes, please. He allowed his smile to widen, looking excited as he wiped his hands on his pants. This should be fun. Plenty, I muttered. Hey, I know real names are taboo, but about that, I overheard two kids walk along the tree line talking a while ago. One was telling this story about someone named Tamlin. It's too long to tell you all about it. He almost sounded embarrassed. But I like the story, so that's what I'd like for you to call me. Tamlin. Tamlin saved me the effort of making up a name of my own, seeing as he simply began calling me Janet. I had little say in it, but I figured complaining wouldn't help. Who was that woman? What did she want? I eventually asked him. We had been walking for a while, me on the path and him beside it. Who can say? I don't know her personally. We're not like one big family here, he began. Maybe she wanted to eat you. Or maybe she was lonely and wanted company but didn't know how to go about it. Are there more like her? Yes, there's always more. On the plus side, it's rare to come across the aggressive ones. I don't even know what she was doing so close to the path. The likes of her usually stay in hiding. Right, the path. Why don't you walk on it? Because your people put it there, he replied, seemingly thinking this a valid explanation. It's not our ground to tread on. Tam wasn't uncommunicative. He asked me a lot of things about myself, my everyday life, and even my dog. I tried to tell him as much as I could without giving anything away that I shouldn't. He didn't like talking about the woods, though, and I suspected he was tired of the topic. It would turn out he was quite the skilled guide. Sometimes, we'd hear odd noises ahead, like shouting or chanting, and he'd make us stay in place until they'd faded into the distance. He could sense when there was somebody ahead we needed to be wary of, and told me when it was safe to call for chips and when to stay silent. Tam himself would occasionally stray from my side and go deeper into the woods in search of the dog, so I wouldn't have to leave the path. I watched the sun set through the canopy of leaves above. We hadn't come across anyone else, and there was no trace of chips. I was tired and my feet were starting to hurt. I couldn't believe that the woods were too big to comb through in an entire day. I had never imagined them to be this huge. I thought about calling my parents, but not wanting to worry them, I decided against it. I lived next door to them, in a much tinier house that also belonged to us. They wouldn't notice my absence for the time being. The forest floor was soft, but still quite unpleasant to sleep on. Tam was obviously completely unfazed by the prospect of resting on the bare ground, but he didn't give me grief for being squeamish. The uncomfort was one thing, but what was worse was that I felt utterly exposed. I spent the night wide awake, restless and afraid. Nothing happened, though. When Tam woke up, it was still dark. There was no reason to keep lying around, so we moved on. I saw the sun rise overhead. We kept calling out for chips, but still came up with nothing. Remembering what Duncan had said about the more dangerous inhabitants of the woods living further in the back, I asked Tam if it was true. I guess, he replied curtly. It made me think. I wasn't feeling well, and there was no trace of chips. The further we'd go in, the more threats there'd be on the way. Was my dog even alive anymore? Maybe, I thought, just maybe it'd be better for me to simply go back. I'm pretty sure Tam knew what I was thinking. He did his best to encourage me, probably afraid to lose his temporary source of entertainment this early on. Hey, you can do this. I'll keep you safe. Okay? Do you need anything? I know where to get you food and water if that's what you want. Water. I had all but forgotten about how thirsty I was. Duncan had told me not to eat or drink here, but he'd also said that if I had to, I could. What other solution was there anyways? Tam assured me that the water was clean and safe to consume. He said he'd fetch it from a nearby creek. He offered to take me with him, but I told him I'd rather stay on the path. Otherwise, we'd end up lost. A lump in my throat, I watched him walk off. I wasn't thrilled about being on my own, but I knew I was safe on the path. I tried to curl up in the middle of it, hoping to hide myself, or at least keep my head low. I felt like an idiot, and it wasn't too effective either. My stomach dropped when I suddenly heard multiple sets of footsteps up ahead. The unmistakable crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs came closer and closer, and I nervously stared off into the direction they were coming from. Soon enough, I spotted 4 figures appearing from behind a bunch of hedges. Noticing they were drawing closer, I staggered to my feet. It looked to be 3 women and a man, all of them dressed in rags rather than actual clothing. Carefully staying beside the trail, they slowly walked up to me. The one that came closest first was one of the women. She was tall, almost unnaturally so. Her hair was tousled and reached all the way down to her hip. Her face was covered in a mix of scars and slowly healing open wounds, as though something or someone had scratched and cut it up. The skin around the cuts was frayed and dirty. "Hello." Her tone was almost cordial, but there was something about her voice that threw me off. It didn't sound as though speech came natural to her, more like she was mimicking a noise she'd heard before without understanding the meaning of the word. It was simply off. I returned her greeting, eyes downcast as the other 3 stepped up to me as well. "Are you here on your own?" the woman asked. "No. I have someone with me. He'll be back soon." "Ah, where did he go?" She didn't sound like she believed me. "To get water," I muttered. "So he's from the woods?" "Yes." I finally dared to meet her gaze. Her eyes were too wide to look normal. I toyed with the idea of asking her about Chips and eventually pressed out the question, shifting my weight from one foot to another uncomfortably. "That dog is yours?" "Oh, I've seen it." Quiet chuckles rippled through the small group as they exchanged knowing glances. "I can show you where, but you'd have to come with us, obviously." She regarded me with a half-smile. I doubted she actually expected me to agree. I would have had to be pretty stupid to do so. "Get back," I told her firmly as she leaned in to sniff my shoulder. She straightened up again. Then one of her companions reached out, and before I knew it, she had pushed me and I staggered, landing on my behind on the ground beside the path. Before I could get up again, the tall woman grabbed me by the back of my neck and lifted me to my feet. "See? Now we're on the same page. Not that bad, is it?" she hissed softly, that alligator-like smirk still on her chapped, thin lips. "Let go of me," I growled, suppressing the fear in my voice as I struggled and eventually managed to tear out of her grasp, her nails leaving painful marks on my skin. I couldn't get back on the path in time, though, as the man from the group had moved in front of me, blocking it off. I stumbled away from him and the tall lady, while the other 2 quickly stepped over the trail to join us on our side. "It's been a while since I last talked to one of your people," the giant woman said, slowly proceeding towards me. "See my face," she went on, tilting her head. "That was one of you guys. Now, I doubt there's any relation between you and him, but I'm sure you understand my wish to compensate." I didn't care to find out how exactly she wanted to do that. I hastily took off in the opposite direction, praying the head start would allow me to shake them off. I could already hear them starting to run after me. In between gasps for air, I screamed for Tam Lin in the vain hope that he was somewhere nearby. I tried to keep my pace, chasing off birds and critters alike as my leaps slowly turned into lumbering, faltering hops. Like a pack of wolves, the group was still on my heels, and they were catching up, tiring me out. Looking over my shoulder, I saw the tall woman leading her hunting party, a triumphant leer already on her face, when all of a sudden, a figure burst out from the underbrush and lunged at her from the side. The lady was too surprised to react, and before I could blink, the other person had thrown her to the ground. I could see them clearly now, and my chest grew light with relief when I recognized Tam Lin. Crouching on the larger woman's chest, he dug his fingers into her face, grabbing onto the flayed edges of her wounded skin and starting to pull. Her scream was blood-curdling, an ear-piercing wail of agony. Her 3 companions had stopped in their tracks, staring at the scene in shock but not doing anything to stop it. After just a few seconds, Tam got up, in his hand a small, red patch of torn skin which he dropped to the ground as he backed off. What followed was an awkward display. The woman staggered to her feet as we stood and stared. The pack looked back at us in stunned silence. They were first to turn and leave, though, and it was only when we couldn't see them anymore that I dared to turn and face Tam Lin. "You left the path," he said, sounding soberly astounded rather than angry. I couldn't speak, my throat sore from all the screaming. Still close to tears, I nodded quietly. Tam swallowed. He looked uneasy, but managed to give me a smile. "It's okay. We'll find it again. We need to get you water first anyways. I found the creek. It's just a little bit ahead. Let's go there first, and then we'll look for the trail." I nodded again, following him once more as he led me through the trampled-down bushes he'd emerged from. The creek was nice and clear, completely undisturbed in its route through the forest. I didn't bother looking for any sort of cup. I simply dropped to my knees and began to shovel the water into my mouth with both hands. Before long, I dipped my head into it, greedily sucking it up as Tam stood and watched. Once I was full, I let out a deep, content sigh and plopped down in the tall grass. I had forgotten how thirsty I'd been this whole time. We stayed for only a few minutes before making our way back to the path. And that's when disaster struck. There's no way to talk around it. We couldn't find it anymore. We searched all of the surrounding terrain, trying to spot it in the thicket, but to no avail. By the time the sun set, I was starting to panic. I took out my phone, hoping to find a map of this place and perhaps call my parents, only to find that the battery had died. It was completely useless. Night fell, and we had to stop and get some rest. Then sunrise came again, and we moved on. This cycle would repeat itself 4 times before I lost hope. I still remember the exact moment I realized it was futile. There was no way out anymore. The woods had swallowed it. I was trapped. It took me a long time to accept my fate. I cried for 2 entire days. Tam Lin tried to console me, but despite his good intentions, he failed. I'd never see my parents again. I'd never find myself in the comforts of my home. After these 2 days, however, things changed. I grew melancholy, then oddly content. The woods have an eerily soothing effect on those that it captures. That's the only way I can explain it. I kept looking for Chips, hoping to at least reunite with her one day. We asked everyone we met on our journeys through these endless woods. That's another weird thing. It didn't feel like I was an outsider anymore. The tribespeople, however bizarre and intimidating they'd seem, would treat me as one of their own. I wasn't being hunted anymore. I got used to sleeping on the cold ground. I even began to appreciate it. Whenever I'd rest my head on it, I felt as though I was listening to the earth's heartbeat. Tamlin and I would sleep side by side like we had during my first night here. Then we moved closer to one another. Then even closer still. I became accustomed to the warmth of his breath on my neck. It was a soft, comforting feeling, him holding my hand and pressing his cheek to mine. One day, he uttered his true name to me and I told him my own. I would rarely feel hunger or thirst anymore, and on the few occasions that I did, the woods would feed me. I think I must have forgotten why I'd gone down that path in the first place. I forgot who I was and what life outside had been like. I even forgot about Chips. I kept on counting the days though, even though I'd forgotten why. 988. That's how many sunrises passed until the day I woke up to barking. I hadn't heard any sounds like it in so long I couldn't even place it at first. My eyes adjusting to the bright sunlight, I could make out something large and dark right above me. When it came down to touch my face, I found it to be wet and warm. A snout? By the time a large, pink tongue came out of it and started to lick the length of my cheek, I was certain. And then it all came back to me. It was my sweet, giant puppy. Her collar was still around her neck, the leash attached to it dirty and caked with mud as it had been dragging behind her all this time. I stared at her for a minute straight before I dared to reach out and touch her, afraid I would find her to be an illusion or some sort of fever dream. My hands met with matted fur and warm skin underneath. I grabbed her, pulled her onto my lap and hugged her tightly. I couldn't believe it. All memory of her had been erased from my mind. For all I knew, she could have died in those woods months ago. But there she was. Tam looked on in disbelief. Chips began to hop around, looking excited. She ran ahead for a bit and then returned, almost like she wanted to show me something. I rushed after her, and Tam followed. Chips led us through the tall grass and hedges in a weird, bendy route that made me wonder where we were going to end up. We wandered around for almost an entire day before finding ourselves in a spot that looked faintly familiar to me. It's hard to remember details of a place where there is nothing but greenery, but I knew I'd been there before. And then I saw it, the narrow little dirt path. I was going to get home. After all this time, I hadn't even thought of it as possible. My desire to return to my former life was greater than ever, and I was finally hopeful again. I picked up Chip's leash and grabbed Tam by the hand, dragging him along with me as I took up running. I didn't stop, not even when I was starting to get tired. Finally, I saw a light up ahead, brighter than the sunlight I'd seen filtered through the leaves. It was the end of the path, the exit. I slowed down, my breathing ragged and strained. Chips nudged my arm with her head, and I turned to look back at Tam. "So you're leaving," he said. "Honestly, I didn't think you would. Ever." "Me neither," I admitted. I squeezed his hand before letting go of it. He nodded slowly and reached up to scratch the back of his neck. "I won't lie, with you gone, there's no reason for me to stay any longer either," he muttered. "I thought you'd stay here with me, see? I was happy when we were all by ourselves. I could have left already when you told me your name, but I didn't want to. Well, it doesn't matter anymore, does it?" I stared at him with wide eyes, unable to comprehend what he was saying. He just smiled, walking ahead of me towards the exit. It was only then that I noticed he was walking on the path, just like me. He'd been right behind me this entire time, and I hadn't even realized it. Now, standing by the edge of the forest, Tam motioned for me to follow. Still utterly confused, I hurried to join him. When we stepped outside the woods, the light was almost blinding. I blinked, but Tam stared up at the bright sky, completely unfazed. "It feels so different here," he breathed, lightly kicking the ground with his boot. It's not like I imagined, but it's nice. He turned to me with a curious expression. Is it the way you remembered? I was too stunned to say a word. Tam tilted his head at me. You don't have to look so shocked. It was you who told me your name. That meant a lot to me. It still does. Knowing the name of one of your people, it makes us special. It means we can tread on your ground, that we can leave. Not my original goal. I just wanted your company. Before all this, I'd see you every time you walked by the woods with that dog. I was always watching, and I kept wondering what you were like. I made up my little plan and it worked, as you can see. He let out a soft chuckle. I told you some of us are lonely, so I wasn't completely dishonest with you. I even said that pets don't run off there for no reason. Frowning, he added, I don't know how Chips found you again. I thought I'd lured her deep enough into the forest for her to never get back, especially with her little doggy brain. It took me a little while to regain my ability to speak. You can't be serious. I figured this would come as a surprise. I was never obvious about it. That's why I didn't come along with you right away either. He gave me an almost sad smile. Honestly, I feel bad about it. I really do. I know how much you wanted to go home. I was never going to use force to keep you in there. I just kept leading you away from the path once I got the chance. I messed with your head a little, didn't let you see your way home. But it was the woods' influence too. What? You said you could check the date on your phone. We're outside. It'll work now. Check. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my cell phone, only to find that I could actually turn it on. It was extremely low on battery, but it worked. A look at the date told me that exactly 3 days had passed since I'd last looked at it. That's impossible, I breathed. How? I counted the days. That's not my doing. It's the woods. They can make you think a few hours are months and that a week is an eternity. Humans come and go, and all experience that effect. My head swam, and there was an odd ringing in my ears. I felt like I was going to pass out. And you're letting me go? It was difficult finding and forming those words, but I forced them through my trembling lips nonetheless. What else am I supposed to do? I don't want to hurt you. I'm just gonna see what this side of the world has to offer. It wasn't my initial plan, but I guess it could be worse. At least it's a change. Do you know how boring it is to stay in the same place for decades? Centuries? We've been there for so long. No wonder some of us have gone insane over time. And when you're in there, you keep seeing the ones outside, you people, and, well, you never think you're gonna get out. Until you do, I guess. I stared at him with wide, incredulous eyes, my mouth agape. Tam Lin took my hand again, seemingly trying to look encouraging. I would have pulled away, had it not been for me being frozen in place. I'm gonna be good, I promise, he said softly, an almost childlike glee in his gaze. I won't hurt anybody here. I'll make myself fit in just fine. Besides, things worked out for the one you called Duncan as well. Fourth story. Hunted by a Wendigo. I realize how unbelievable this story might be, but I assure you it's entirely true. I've had countless experiences with the supernatural since I was 4. I'm 33 now, but this is one of the most terrifying ones I've had. I've looked at some of the stories in this community to see if there's anything I haven't discovered yet. I thought that if I shared my encounter here, there might be someone who has some information that could help. Please don't comment if you don't believe in the supernatural. I've seen skeptics plastering their 2 cents on some posts. I'm looking for legitimate information. My questions are at the end of this. Thanks in advance. I had an experience with a Wendigo this fall in early October in northern Minnesota in a state forest very close to, if not on, a reservation. I've always heard that speaking of them can draw them to you, but I hadn't thought of or listen to any Wendigo stories anytime close to my encounter. I was staying with some very dear friends. I'll call them M and C, and they have a camper in their yard by the lake for guests to sleep in. I had walked down to the camper from the house with my miniature dachshund, Ebony, around midnight and found that I needed to set some things up, primarily the heater. By the time I was done getting everything in order, it was approximately 1:30. I never thought to lock the door because, really, I figured it's in the middle of the woods, so there was nothing to worry about. I was wrong. I had closed the curtains, thank God, and I was having trouble falling asleep because my anxiety was going mad. M and C's dogs were barking outside, and their geese wouldn't stop honking. Ebony, who usually sleeps under the covers, was sitting on my hip while I laid on my side, and I could feel her turning her head back and forth, like she was trying to track something outside. I tried tucking her under the blankets to calm her down, but she kept returning to her perch on my hip. I have no idea how long I laid there. I would say at least 40 minutes, when all of a sudden I heard M's voice outside the camper. "Anybody in there?" And what sounded like claws dragged down the side of the camper. I almost called back to her when I realized, number one, she and C were both fast asleep by now, and number two, M knew I was in there. She wouldn't ask if anybody was. Suddenly, I noticed everything had gone absolutely silent outside. The dogs and the birds had stopped carrying on. The gusts of wind had even stopped. It was the kind of silence you hear about in horror stories. How the woods go mute when something evil is in the area. Then another thought hit me. Ebony would be losing her *T and barking at the door if that had been anything human. She was frozen on my hip, dead quiet, shaking. I didn't dare to move, but I was really starting to have to pee, and I remembered that I hadn't locked the door. I have no idea how long I laid there debating whether I should get up and use the bathroom and lock the door, but it felt like an eternity. In reality, I guessed it was maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I thought it may have been a skinwalker at first, but remembered they don't mimic the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the woods. Wendigo do. I knew these creatures, demons, whatever they are, can lure humans out of their abodes if they make eye contact with you. And everything in me was screaming to make sure I didn't look outside. I made doubly sure I didn't look through any cracks in the curtains as I walked softly to the front of the camper, and very slowly turned the lock, praying and holding my breath. I made sure to keep my eyes away from the windows as I crawled back in bed, and pulled Ebony close, and she finally stayed under the blankets. I snuck a peek at my phone for the time before I laid down, figuring it had to be close to 3 a.m., the witching hour. It was about 2:30. As soon as I laid down, the wind kicked back up and M and C's basset hounds erupted into howls as they came running down to the camper and a little ways into the trees, and the geese started their noise again. I heard the bassets come back to the camper, barking a few more times before they laid down outside the door to protect me. I didn't get out of bed again that night. I told M and C what had happened the next morning. I think I was hoping M would say she had come down to check on me and Ebony, but she confirmed what I already knew. They had gone to bed as soon as I had left the house. I said a prayer over their house, the camper, and all of us the following night and had an uneventful night. Thank God. I also spoke with another guy who's familiar with the supernatural to see if he knew any more about Wendigo. I'm not sure how accurate the information he gave me was, or if it's reliable at all, but when I asked him why Ebony hadn't made a peep, I had assumed it was because she was absolutely petrified. He said a Wendigo can control animals to keep them from alerting their owners about its presence. He also told me one. They can't enter houses that aren't made of wood directly from the forest they're hunting in, tents and campers included, because they consist of man-made materials too. A lock is useless. They can unlock and open a door so they can try to lure you outside in 3. They typically stay in the woods, but they will come into a smaller town and never into a city. I had never heard of any of what he told me before, so again, I can't speak for accuracy, but I also haven't researched the claims either. He also advised me never to go outside to pee at night if I ever go camping, and to bring a bucket or something to use, and to make sure that I always close tent flaps and curtains before falling asleep. He said if the flaps are open so you can see outside, the Wendigo can make eye contact with you and draw you out. After leaving M and C's to go to my father's house for a few days, I had the distinct feeling of being watched when I took Ebony outside after dark. My father lives 3 hours away from M and C, but his house is in the country. I told myself it was only the fear from the experience and what I know about the Wendigo triggering an overactive imagination. I never heard anything, and I watched Ebony's behavior very closely, and she didn't act like she had in the camper. I'm moving back to that area from Canada, and this experience has been weighing heavily on my mind. I've been trying to find any information about warding them off, or if they have a home hunting range like cougars do, or if they move on from a region. My prayers did work the second night, so I figure I can pray over the property. I also have holy water that I can use, since the Wendigo is an evil spirit that possesses people or physically manifests. Frustratingly, a majority of what comes up in searches is utter garbage like Wikipedia. Does anyone know if a Wendigo stays in one area? Are my concerns about it coming back when I get moved into my cabin warranted? Or am I worrying excessively? 5th story. Possible Wendigo sighting. Montrose, Colorado. Tonight I was discussing this extremely weird and terrifying experience my friend and I had when we gave someone a ride home. To give into more context of what happened and why I stated possible sighting. I live on the western slope of Colorado, and I'm an avid marijuana user, especially when I'm up late with a friend working on a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. So it's really difficult for me to say it's real being under the influence. The strange thing about it is how my friend and I felt and saw. It was in late spring, and we were working on a campaign late in the evening, and we got the munchies. I know. How can we be more stereotypical? My friend only lives 4 blocks away from a gas station, and it can be accessed from side streets. Being under the influence, I did not want to take a main street or go far at all. It wasn't responsible of me, and excusing using side streets doesn't justify it. Again, I know it was irresponsible of me. But moving on, as we were leaving the convenience store, my friend was stopped by a woman he knew growing up, and she was close friends with his mother. She was extremely intoxicated and alone, so my friend offered her a ride home to make sure she got back safe. Now here's where things got really weird. Without conversing with each other, my friend and I both felt like she was not safe to walk. I played this off as being a woman in her 60s or early 70s, intoxicated and completely alone. She claimed it was only up the block away, but it was actually a few miles outside of town. It would have easily taken her over a few hours for her to get home. Being in a small town, we have no Uber, Lyft, and taxis are pretty much triple the price at this hour. So we both felt really off that she was okay to walk that far, at 1:30 in the morning. When we get down the road from her place, she asked us to drop her off away from her place so that her boyfriend doesn't see our headlights. This point, I didn't want to go into anything further, and there was so many red flags about the situation, I knew it's best to just drop her off as requested and go back to my friend's house. As I reversed down this single-lane dirt road, I told my friend that I'm going to just pull over before we get back into town because I really needed to use the bathroom, and we then both agreed that she was in a very bad situation tonight. Once I turn around this bend in the road, my headlights shined into a small group of trees and bushes. I noticed this extremely large elk-like creature lowering itself from being exposed from my headlights. I could make out the face, but it wasn't normal like an elk. large antlers. It came off like dead tree branches. The front legs were inverted, skinny, and extremely long. I could tell because its hind legs and lower half were lower than its upper body. Could have been crouching or sitting though. Upper torso was huge, and I thought I saw stripes on its fur, but my friend said it looked like it was its rib cage exposed. The eyes did reflect from when the high beams exposed it in the trees, and at first, I assumed it was an elk because they're everywhere in this area. But it was extremely huge, easily over 15 foot tall but thin. I didn't immediately react to it and kept driving, but when I did see it, the conversation between my friend and I stopped as if we both saw it and trying to process it. After I pulled off to use the restroom roughly a mile away from where I saw that, I couldn't help but to keep looking down the road, making sure that creature wasn't coming after us. It was a feeling I never experienced before, and when I turned around to get back into the car, I couldn't help but notice my friend staring down the road as well, doing the exact same thing I was doing. I asked him if he saw something as well, and he said what he saw was something that looked like the forest spirit in the Studio Ghibli movie Princess Mononoke, but from hell. At this point, my fear was validated, and I jumped into the car and sped off. The feeling we both had was more than a sense of dread, and almost like we were being hunted, or if we were to investigate it at the time, our lives would have been in danger. I never in my life felt this type of fear before, and it was a new experience that I never in my life was to have. I'm glad she made it safe, and we were in the right place at the right time to give her the help she needed. After that situation, I was informed about her life of substance use and struggles, that it's actually gotten worse over the years. Ever since that night, my friend and I dealt with lots of personal things very similar. Our marijuana use increased to cope with major depression, suicidal ideation, death in family, and just overall rough times since that night. I struggle to claim there is some association with what we saw that night, but it's very strange how our lives got increasingly worse since. I tried doing research on Wendigo and even Skinwalker, but I get a lot of stories that's hard to take in as real encounters and would love to learn more on them.